Good evening, Lake Orion. Welcome to History Now here on ONTV. I'm your host, Anthony Taramina, and I want to talk to you guys today about something that, might be a little bit out of the ordinary for our viewers. Back in the 1990s, I was a big time. One of the biggest things that I actually liked was professional wrestling, and one of my good friends ended up getting me involved and interested in watching professional wrestling. So every Monday night, I would be watching either the WWF, the World Wrestling Federation, or World Championship Wrestling, WCW. So I want to talk to you today about the Monday Night Wars. The Monday Night Wars was a wrestling war between owner Vince McMahon of the WWF and Ted Turner, who was the owner of WCW, from about the time period of 1995 to about 2001, where from 1996 to about 1998, from May of 96 to May of 98, for 2 years, WCW was beating WWF in the ratings war to the point where the WWF was almost being forced out of business at the hands of WCW and the ratings war. But there is a whole history that goes prior to 1995, and it actually started back in the 1980s. This was a war between Vince McMahon and Ted Turner. At that point, the WWF, today WWE, World Wrestling Entertainment, had cable networks on USA. Later on, it would be UPN and Spike TV, but their primary cable network was the USA Network, which was NBC. And WCW, Monday Nitro, which was owned by Ted Turner, started on WTBS and also would come on TNT. Ted Turner always had a heart for wrestling, and he always loved professional wrestling. So in the 1980s, at the time, wrestling was based on territories. The WWF was mostly based in the Northeast. Their headquarters was located in Sanford, Connecticut, still is to this day. And WCW, for the most part, was located in the southern territories, particularly Georgia, the Carolinas. And WCW had, at that point, this was before WCW, but they were affiliated with the members of the NWA, which was the National Wrestling Alliance. Well, the WWF broke away from the NWA in the 80s, and then WCW would eventually break away, but they were affiliated at the end of the time, the 80s, with the NWA, so which they had a governing board, and they decided who their world champion was going to be. And a lot of times, that champion would be Ric Flair, the Nature Boy Ric Flair, who ended up becoming a 16-time world heavyweight champion. And a lot of those was from his days in the NWA and WCW. Anyways, in 1983, there was a situation where the WWF ended up buying Georgia Championship Wrestling, which was owned by the Briscoes. And as a result, and one of the things was the Georgia Championship Wrestling, the Briscoes had access to WTBS, which was Ted Turner's cable network. So WWF was broadcasting their programming not just on the USA Network, but also on TBS, which did not make viewers, especially in the southern areas, very, very happy. The wrestling fans in the South preferred old-fashioned, brawling, hardcore wrestling. They weren't fond with Vince McMahon's entertainment product, which was where the WWF was going to, which at the time they were beginning to promote entertainment. They were going into the sports entertainment business. So that was regarded as Black Saturday for many wrestling viewers. As a result, there was pressure, ratings were dropping on TBS, so Ted Turner forced Vince McMahon to sell that TV slot to Jim Crockett Promotions, which would become the catalyst for WCW. Jim Crockett was an owner. He ended up having his own wrestling company, Jim Crockett Promotions, and that became the prelude to WCW. And at that time, there was direct competition, especially the pay-per-view industry. As I said, Vince McMahon was going into the entertainment business. He started promoting events, WrestleMania in 1984, WrestleMania 1, which featured the main event of Hulk Hogan and Mr. T versus Rowdy Piper and Cowboy Bob Orndorff. But then the popularity of WrestleMania encouraged WWF to produce several more pay-per-views, Survivor Series in the fall, particularly November, the Royal Rumble in January, and SummerSlam in August. Now, WrestleMania was particularly March and April. So Jim Crockett Promotion tried to counter the WWF with shows like Starrcade, Clash of the Champions, Wrestle War, those events but as a result, Vince McMahon was very angry over the competition because the WWF was the #1 wrestling promotion at the time. So Vince McMahon forced pay-per-views to choose between whether to promote the WWF or to promote the Jim Crockett Promotions, which the majority of pay-per-view subscribers mostly chose the WWF. Only 3 providers provided for Jim Crockett Promotions. So as a result of the lack of promoting, the lack of having it on pay-per-view, the lack of TV rates, Jim Crockett Promotions went downhill. They weren't able to finance their wrestling organization. So Jim Crockett sold Jim Crockett Promotions to Ted Turner, who ended up calling Vince McMahon and said, "Hey, Vince, I'm in the wrestling business." Vince McMahon responded, "Congratulations, I'm in the sports entertainment business." So, as a result, from 1988 to about 1994, there was a direct competition between the WWF and WCW, which eventually the name would be after 1988. Vince McMahon at that time had stars like Hulk Hogan, the Macho Man Randy Savage, Jake the Snake Roberts, Rowdy Piper, Jim Duggan. WCW provided an alternative. They had wrestlers like Sting, Mick Foley, Dusty Rhodes, a lot of good names. But WCW was seen as an alternative to the WWF. The WWF was the top company at the time, and it was very, very interesting. Ric Flair actually joined the WWF for a time from 1991 to 1993. WWF was developing a star in The Undertaker, still wrestling from time to time. But also at the time, WWF had one key owner, which was Vince McMahon. He was the main owner. He also promoted himself as an announcer. For the most part, his announcers included Gorilla Monsoon, Bobby the Brain Heenan, Mean Gene Okerlund. WCW, however, went through a system of owners who obviously had to serve Ted Turner. Jim Herd was a good example. Many wrestling promoters did not like him. Kip Fry, the wrestlers really liked him. Bill Watts, Cowboy Bill Watts. He used to run Georgia Championship Wrestling as well in the past before the Briscoes took over. Bill Watts was very, very old school. He took away the wrestling floor mats. He had the faces and the heels, which in wrestling terms, face means that you're a good guy. A heel means that you're a bad guy. So he's had them in separate locker rooms. He cut back pay. He's very, very old school, and a lot of the wrestlers did not like him. So he was forced out in 1993 after allegedly being seen as a racist. Then also as a result, Eric Bischoff comes in the picture. what Eric Bischoff does is he makes a few moves. Jim Ross, who was seen as WCW's top announcer at the time, was taken off in the air. Jim Ross would ultimately go to WWF. He also would encourage WCW to go more in the entertainment business. So as a result, he would bring in Hulk Hogan, Randy Savage. He also added in Sting and Ric Flair, bringing them in as well, included. They were always there, most part. But, I mean, so we encouraged WCW to go down that same route in 1994, 93, 94, but at the time, the WWF was developing stars called the New Generation, which was, as I said, like The Undertaker, Bret the Hitman Hart, Shawn Michaels, Owen Hart, Razor Ramon, Diesel. Even though Vince McMahon loved to have the big 300-pound champions, he was also relying on smaller wrestlers as well, like Shawn Michaels and Bret Hart, to steal the show in matches. And WWF ended up being still the top wrestling company despite a steroid trial. There was a federal indictment against Vince McMahon over steroids. Vince McMahon almost went to jail. He was ultimately acquitted. But it caused a lot of damage in the WWF, often perceived as, with wrestlers, you think of big, bulky steroids. It was just a mess where the WWF suffered, had to rebuild its image. It suffered for about 2-3 years where business was not going well. House shows, which are live events that the wrestling business uses to help promote itself, that was not going well. But, I mean, it was still manageable as well. Main evented mostly The Undertaker, Yokozuna. Their rivalry was very, very intense. Also, you had, WCW still had Hogan and Hogan, Sting. They were making that transition to where, but WCW was seen as copying the WWF, and that did not go very well, especially with the Southern fans. When we come back to History Now, I'm going to talk about 1995 here on History Now on ONTV.
We own a Habitat home.
I love working on my Habitat home.
Soy dueño de una casa de Habitat.
My neighbor is a Habitat homeowner.
Being a Habitat homeowner has changed our lives.
My mortgage payment for Habitat is less than what I pay for rent.
Habitat for Humanity of Oakland County currently has homes available with mortgage payments lower than most rent payments. If you or someone you know needs decent and affordable housing, call 248-338-1843 or visit our website at habitatoakland.org.
Welcome back to History Now here on ONTV. I'm Anthony Taormina. I want to get back to my subject on the Monday Night Wars. I want to get back to talking about 1995. As I mentioned, at that point in 1994, the WWF was promoting newer stars. They were promoting The Undertaker, Bret Hart, Shawn Michaels, Razor Ramon, who was Scott Hall, Diesel, who was Kevin Nash. They were calling them the New Generation, based upon that they were newer stars, that they were. Some were small. I mean, there's a nice influx of smaller stars and bigger stars all fighting each other with these newer characters based on the good guy, bad guy, face, heel persona. It did create, though, despite business not being great, it did create some interesting television. Also, WWF was getting other stars like Lex Luger, Tatanka, Bam Bam Bigelow, IRS, wrestlers that were pretty established, but they were also building new stars. WCW had Hulk Hogan come in, Randy Savage come in. They had a lot of the older stars that were very successful in the WWF from 1991, 1992 were making the jump to WCW. A lot of wrestling fans down south were getting very frustrated. Eric Bischoff obviously wanted to bring in Hulk Hogan, wanted to bring in the entertainment values. And at the same time, they was kind of alienating wrestling fans because they wanted to see Sting, Ric Flair, Mick Foley, Vader, Mark Morrow. And as a result, that forced several stars to consider looking elsewhere. But when we get to 1996, I'll certainly bring that up. But in 1994 and 1995, the WWF was still the top wrestling company. It would change, however, in 1995. At that point, WWF debuted a show. They actually debuted this in 1993, Monday Night Raw, where it would run for 1 hour Monday night on the USA Network, where it would be taped shows, mostly featuring superstars of theirs squashing jobbers. Jobbers means that those are no-name wrestlers that would often get squashed or do the job. In wrestling terms, the job means that you're intentionally losing the match or making the bigger star look good. So, as a result, their shows were taped. So, Eric Bischoff got called into Ted Turner's office at the CNN Center because their company was based in Atlanta, Georgia, which is home of CNN, the CNN Center. Turner ended up asking Bischoff how he could compete with the WWF, or the WWE, which is called today. Bischoff came up with a wacky idea, thinking that it was not going to get approved. He wanted to have 2 hours on TNT every Monday night. Ted Turner agreed. So, in October 1995, they saw the debut of WCW Monday Nitro, with the main event being Sting versus Ric Flair. And Lex Luger ended up making a shocking appearance back into WCW. Prior to that, he was in WCW, but then he came into WWF from 1992 to about 1995. And it was unexpected because at that time, WCW brought up the idea of where the big boys play. They brought in the idea of bringing in stars to surprise them. The thing was they were going live. WCW debuted at the Mall of America in Minneapolis, and it was quite a good show. But at the time, the WWF was not involved, was not programming anything that night. But WCW intended to debut, and they ended up getting a pretty good rating out of it. They ended up getting I think a 2.8 that night. So then they ended up. So the next week they went against each other head to head. And as a result, WCW won the night. They won 2-5 to 2-3, which was a big ratings win for WCW. But it was encouraging fans that, hey, you got an alternative to watch every Monday night. So as a result, at the same time, they were doing nasty skits where Eric Bischoff was encouraging his announcers, Tony Schiavone, Steve Mongo McMichael, Bobby the Brain Heenan, who jumped ship from WWF to WCW, to give out wrestling results. And they would give out the results on purpose of the WWF because they knew that they were taped, whereas Nitro was live, so you could tune in to Monday Nitro, which was what they called it. They called it Monday Nitro. And to encourage them to go live. So then it got nasty between the two wrestling companies. So as a result, there were skits that were going on. There was numerous like parodies. Eric Bischoff had Medusa or Alundra Blaze in the WWF. She defected. She was originally from WCW anyways as Medusa. He had her throw the women's championship in the trash. The WWF would come up with parodies of Hulk Hogan, Randy Savage, Ted Turner, and Mean Gene Okerlund. Mean Gene Okerlund, who, like Bobby the Brain Heenan, was in WWF but then jumped ship to WCW in '93. And it got nasty. And then there was also several lawsuits that were filed. There was lawsuits that copyright infringement, and no business doing it, which ultimately there were several court cases that were involved, but it ultimately never really got anywhere. So, but for now, they were fighting throughout from late 1995, early 1996. At that point, the WWF was still, they still had their stars: Undertaker, Bret Hart, Shawn Michaels, Kevin Nash, Scott Hall, and WCW still had Hogan, Savage, Flair, Sting. I mean, Luger. It was getting nasty. But until 1996, one thing that was in 1996, Scott Hall and Kevin Nash decided to defect from the WWF to WCW. One of the big things that was on their contracts was money. There was a lot. WCW was offering a lot more money. They were offering guaranteed contracts, whereas the WWF, they weren't offering guaranteed contracts. They were offering just the promise that you go out there, you compete, you get paid. Whereas in WCW, you're guaranteed a certain amount of money. Now, they were also given a certain amount of creative control over the characters. Now, Hulk Hogan, when he went to WCW, he was given absolute creative control over his character. So as a result, the wrestler can control his character. It drove bookers crazy. So Hogan kind of set that into place back in 1994 when he signed with WCW. Scott Hall and Kevin Nash also were able to get some sort of creative controls in their character, but they wanted guaranteed money. So that was why they defected to WCW. Now, in 1996, we saw the formation of the New World Order, the NWO, which for WCW, this was a big-time ratings success. In 1996, and as a result, in 1996, WCW's ratings were starting to go up to 3s and 4s, while the WWF was staying at 2s and 3s. They were appealing to the male teenage demographic, and they were also applying to the kids. And, you know, they had a very unique blend of, you had cruiserweights, which were Mexican wrestlers or luchadors that were wrestling usually the first hour. Then they had the mid-card wrestlers wrestling in the end of the first hour, the second hour. And then they had the main eventers doing mostly the second hour, doing like the end of the second hour. And it was a very good time to be in WCW at that time. Business was booming. Ted Turner was very excited. Hulk Hogan ended up joining the NWO. His character was getting stale. So stale means that like you're getting boring. Fans don't like seeing stale characters. So he became a villain, became Hollywood Hulk Hogan, reinvented himself, and as a result, the NWO was a major power player in WCW. It got to the point where the WWF had to start guaranteeing money as well. They were seeing several stars defect. They were seeing several wrestling they started seeing several. It was very bad time for WWF. But to their credit, according to Mick Foley's Have a Nice Day book, the WWF focused on its remaining stars, like The Undertaker, Bret Hart, Shawn Michaels, and then they were also focusing on newer stars like Vader, who had signed with WWF 96, Goldust, Dustin Rhodes, who had signed in 1995, Mick Foley himself, who signed as Mankind in 1996, Stone Cold Steve Austin in 1995, but also became in 1996, Hunter Hearst Helmsley in 1995 and 96. So, I mean, they were focusing and building new stars. They kept continuing to develop these superstars, and it provided for, and it reignited a wrestling war that was about to begin. Now, I'm going to actually head on off. We're going to actually talk about 1997 on part 2 of the Monday Night Wars. And we'll go from there for On History Now here on ONTV. For now, have a great night, and I'll see you soon.